Welcome to US1 Snapshots, where we do little overviews of big themes in American history. Today, American imperialism. Our focus points for today. The United States had imperial motives and policies through the 1800s and into the early 1900s, with profound or huge impacts. Many Native Americans fought against US imperialism, but were mostly displaced. The U.S. expanded its influence into other nations in the Caribbean, Latin America, and Asia by the early 1900s, with many violent consequences. So what is imperialism exactly? Imperialism really has two distinct meanings. One is describing an action or a set of actions, and the other is describing a set of ideas or an attitude. The imperialistic attitude is much like what we discussed in the presentation on manifest destiny, the idea that one people or culture is superior to another. And sometimes that means that that culture or the superior culture must be spread onto the inferior culture. And that leads us to the set of actions. The actions we might call empire building. And this is when a nation forcefully extends its authority over other territories. Sometimes it doesn't have to be exactly through military territorial conquest, but it can just be through kind of dependence and trade and control from foreign companies that a country could be an imperialistic power. Why are we discussing this? Well, spreading control over foreign nations has been a consistent part of American history and American growth in territory and power over the course of the 1700s through the 1900s. If we look back at before America was actually founded as a country, this was a region that was occupied by Native American tribes with great diversity. And there were several different kinds of cultures all over the American continent and into Central America, like with the Mayans or the Aztec civilization, and into South America with the Inca civilization. All of these would be decimated by European settlement and European imperialism. So firstly, the U.S. 13 colonies broke many treaties with Native Americans, we'll talk about that, and pushed many of the Native Americans westward. But by 1803, the United States purchased a lot of the land from France, another imperial power, and all the resident Native Americans then began to come into conflict with new white settlers. Not all of them. Some of them did have more peaceful arrangements, but as we'll see, those peaceful arrangements could not be trusted. By 1819, the United States absorbed the Spanish territory of Florida, Spain yet another imperial power, and Florida again filled with Native Americans that are eventually going to come into a lot of conflict with white settlers. And by the 1850s or so, the manifest destiny had been realized from the East Coast to the West Coast. America had spread its territorial control. But the conquest was not quite complete in the eyes of many. But let's first talk about what happened to Native Americans. Countless Native tribes were impacted. At times, there was a lot of complexity with these conflicts. It wasn't just like white settlers fought with Native Americans. Some Native tribes fought with each other. There was great diversity. And a tribe like the Pequots was quite hated by a lot of its neighboring tribes, who teamed together with the British and actually exterminated the Pequots in the late 1600s. But early in American history, a lot of Native Americans were just captured and enslaved or sold into slavery. But even the natives that signed treaties were not safe. From the 1770s to the 1870s, every single one of the 500 plus treaties signed with Native American tribes was violated or broken outright by the United States. But the most decimating impact of all to Native American tribes was the disease that came along with European settlers, like smallpox. Look at the population decline from roughly almost 18 million around the time of Columbus to almost 2 million by 150 years later. Here you can see the population collapse in Mexico upon the arrival of Europeans, that about 8 million died in 1520 from a smallpox outbreak. And then 25 years later, 12 to 15 million deaths from the mysterious Cocolitzli, which is a Nahuatl word that just means kind of mysterious illness. And again, another 30 years later, we see another 2 million deaths from a pandemic outbreak. Here in Oregon, in the 1800s, you can see that the non-Indian population is on the rise by the 1840s and 50s. Remember the Manifest Destiny unit. And Here you can see the Indian population on the decline right around the same time. Now, natives did resist to imperialism, and sometimes they fought peacefully, like in the case of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Cherokee Nation actually sued the American government, or the state of Georgia, I should say, and won in the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court actually ruled that the state of Georgia could not move the Cherokee out of their tribal agreement, their treaty recognized territory. But the president, Andrew Jackson at the time, refused to actually enforce the court ruling and ordered the military to move them out anyway. And this precipitated what is known as the Trail of Tears. And for about 40 years, natives were forcefully moved out of the territories in the southeast, and tens of thousands died, including over a quarter of the entire Cherokee population. Now, there were also several wars, violent means of resistance. These are collectively known as the American Indian Wars, and they spanned most of early American history. But from the 1850s to 1870s in particular, there was a tremendous amount of conflict in the Great Plains region, kind of Midwestern United States. In fact, in 1864, a very famous incident where settlers were invited peacefully to come to an American fort, and once they got there, they were massacred. This is known as the Sand Creek Massacre. And this actually inspired a massive tribal unification in a fight against the American government. Of course, the Indians pretty much lost. Now, another attempt was made to try to assimilate Native Americans, to get them to adopt European-style practices like recognizing private property lines and farming and staying in one place instead of roaming around and chasing buffalo. The Dawes Act in particular of 1887, I believe, authorized the president to divide up Indian lands and assign it to ownership slots. This led to all kinds of controversy over who counted as an Indian and who was allowed to get this land. And over the course of the next several years, tribes were broken up and lost control of an estimated 100 million acres of land due to these assimilation attempts. And still to this day, Indian assimilation has not been successful. If we look at the total number of American Indians and Alaska Natives that are on reservations, look at their population percentage of poverty relative to the total U.S. population. So the amount of people that are actually in poverty is much, much higher for Native Americans than for non-Native Americans in the United States. Additionally, we can also see that drug use rates for Native Americans tends to be a lot higher than any other demographic group in America. This is according to the National Study for Drug Use and Habits, I think. You can look that up. I forget exactly what the acronym stands for. Also down here, we can see that the death rate, age adjusted per 100,000 for Native Americans, both male and female, is much higher than any other segment of the American population. So clearly, Native Americans have not really reaped the benefits of the growth of America. You can also see here that Native Americans have a much higher suicide rate than any other demographic group. Now, once the conquest is complete, America shifted its imperialism towards Latin America. And since the early 1800s, the USA has treated Latin America as a zone of US exclusive control. You can see here the political cartoon depicting America protecting Nicaragua and Venezuela, who are having internal conflicts from the likes of England and Germany and Spain and France and Portugal. One of the key pieces of legislation at this time, well, it wasn't exactly a law, but it was an executive directive that basically President Monroe in 1823 issued to Europe. And the Monroe Doctrine told Europe to stay out of Latin America, that the United States was going to protect the Western Hemisphere, and in exchange, America would stay out of European conflicts and affairs. Now, in 1904, President Teddy Roosevelt, depicted here in this political cartoon, almost militarized this Monroe Doctrine and declared that the United States could send its military to intervene and stabilize Latin America. So the United States is now authorizing itself to essentially be the police force for Latin America by the turn of the 20th century. Now, this has many consequences, but even before the Roosevelt Doctrine, before the Roosevelt Corollary, the Monroe Doctrine inspired many expansionist movements into the Latin American territories, including Cuba, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Mexico. And not all of these were actually done by the United States government. So one term that a lot of history textbooks tend to look over is filibusters. And these were actually private armies. So some Americans actually bought soldiers and hired mercenaries to go open up slave colonies in Latin America. This was especially true shortly after the Civil War was underway. But one most famous example was that there was a secret society called the Knights of the Golden Circle. And their goal was actually to create slave colonies in Latin America as slavery became more and more costly and controversial in the United States. In fact, Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was actually a member of this secret society. The most famous filibuster of all, though, was by far William Walker, this gentleman pictured here, who ruled Nicaragua for much of the 1850s with a filibuster army, largely funded by the Vanderbilt family. He was eventually ousted and actually executed by the people of Nicaragua. In Nicaragua today, you can see that the 500 Cordoba bill shows Jose Dolores Estrada Vado, who is a national hero known for defeating William Walker's filibuster army in 1856. Now, throughout the 1800s, the U.S. expanded its influence and control over various parts of the world, including Latin America through the Monroe Doctrine and its Roosevelt Corollary, and several military campaigns were carried out, both by the U.S. government and by private mercenary armies. So here we can see the imperialistic project basically completed, with the United States having multiple interventions into Latin America by the 1920s. Now, in 1898, the Spanish-American War gained the United States a tremendous amount of territory, even into the Pacific. Cuba came under U.S. control, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic all saw U.S. military actually brought in to stabilize the region or settle conflicts and essentially fight on behalf of American interests. But after the Spanish-American War, the United States acquires regions all over the world. So Pacific islands in the South Pacific like Guam, and the Philippines Islands, and also areas in Latin America. Here we can see all the different Pacific Islands that America had expanded its control into, and places in the Caribbean and the Panama Canal Zone that America had some exclusive control over in the early 1900s. Here's a political cartoon depicting U.S. imperialism, with the United States being shown as the teacher of a class against students who are resisting the new territories acquired after the Spanish-American War: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. So this kind of demonstrates that imperialistic attitude that America had, that America thought it was its place to educate and bring its civilization to these foreign territories. But this had violent consequences, like the Philippine-American War. So essentially, the United States paid a bunch of money to actually acquire the Philippine Islands in 1898 after the Spanish-American War, but the Philippines revolted and actually had an independence movement under Emilio Aguinaldo. And this insurrection led to a lot of violence and death and torturing on both sides. There were war atrocities. In some ways, the Philippines might have never really recovered from some of the imperial era. So the fighting lasted for a long time. 600,000 Filipinos died. That's about as many Americans as died in the Civil War. And the Philippines was not granted independence until 1946 on July 4th, ironically. So the other perspective is that the U.S. presence is not for empire extension, but for bringing peace and democracy and free trade to the betterment of other nations. And we can see that this attitude still exists today. The United States has troops deployed in 177 countries with bases all over the world. Active military personnel deployed around the world, over 1.3 million. And we spend more money on military than the next 10 biggest militaries in the world combined. By far, we are the biggest global policemen. So we have continued to act as a global power to this day and have been the world's largest economy since at least the 1920s. So in closing, how has this been an important part of U.S. history?